So my buddy Wes set the bar high for me with a tweet earlier, expecting to be cracked up. If you catch many of my talks, then they're full of esoteric jokes that only I and he get. So sorry, Wes, you're going to be disappointed in this one. I'll just have to blind you with facts about mobile application development. This is something I'm really excited about. Been doing a lot of this more and more lately, and it's been a fun diversion from Ruby web stuffs that normally I get to code on. So a bit about me. My name's Wynn, Netherland. I'm CTO at Pure Charity. We're a nonprofit that is building an application that helps people manage charitable giving accounts and can direct funds towards charitable causes that they care about. Also co-host of the changelog. We cover what's fresh and new and open source, or try to. Also authoring a book on Compass and Sass. If you listen to our podcast, you know that Adam and I talk about that quite a bit. And this is the best cover for this book that we could get. There's, if you are interested in Compass and Sass, Manning's got a deal going on, Sass 40. If you use that code at checkout, you can save 40%. And sadly, Sass 100 is not a valid code. I'm sure people have tried. Cool. We've talked about this briefly, but so now that everybody's in the room, who considers himself a mobile developer? Mike, I know you are. All right. Few hands. All righty.
I travel.
So you develop while being mobile? Okay, I guess that counts. So how many of you want to be a mobile developer? All right, cool. You're in the right spot. We'll see what we can do about that. Buddy of mine, Jake Stutzman, excellent designer. Well, you can't see it there because of the low contrast. He works at elevate.co, excellent design firm. We've worked together in a number of projects. He came to me back in the spring and wanted to build a, I guess, Gowalla for golf. Golf Status is the application that he had. He had pure high-fidelity wireframes in Photoshop that he had developed and was asking, how to bring this to market. And should they go native or should they go web? There's trade-offs both ways. The gap is kind of narrowing. You can do a lot of stuff with web applications that you couldn't before. You'd have to have a native app on the device to do that geolocation and some other things now you can do in the browser. But it basically comes down to the experience that you want to provide and whether or not you want it. The barrier for providing that experience is offsets going through the app stores is pretty much the recommendation that I give. But so why native? This is the design that he had come up with. This is, it was one of those things that as soon as I saw the design, I wanted to be a part of it because it was just such a beautiful application. To go in and pick your courses and to pick a foursome and to play and to log your scores with a foursome and then upload those in a social way. The app is this close to getting released in the App Store, but go to golfstatus.com if you're a golfer and would like to check it out. So he came to me and wanted to build this application. I actually I don't even think it was enlisting my help. He just wanted my opinion on what options were available, native versus web. And I just didn't see delivering this sort of iOS feel in a web application. When you start mimicking native animations and things using HTML5, it's just hard to pull those off without coming across as fake or phony and doing those animations in CSS3, especially if you have a lot of drill down menus and things of that sort. I'm hopeful that one day that won't be the case with jQuery Mobile, Essential Touch, and some other frameworks that are narrowing that gap. But right now, if you really want a native feel, you have to build it natively. And it may always be that way just because native is always moving too as well. Another app that we built, the first app was in iOS for another friend, another app. He came to me and had an agency contract with Gillette and Walmart to build a kiosk to select the user can select their shaver right there on the end cap in Walmart. And it was a really nice looking app. And the interesting constraint there was the agency said we basically are going to build it on a Galaxy tab, and we've already built the kiosk. We just need software. So with those constraints, your options are far fewer. So they either could build it in Java or build it in Adobe Air or something like that. For both projects, I suggested we ended up building them both in Titanium. There's another screenshot of the Gillette application. So when you're building native applications and you want to support iOS and you support Android, you're looking at either Objective-C and Java or both just to get on both platforms. How many of you guys have played with Titanium? Who hasn't heard of it? Okay, fair number of hands. Titanium is from a company called Appcelerator. And basically, you write your applications using one JavaScript API, and you can target multiple platforms. The two big ones out of the box are iOS and Android. They're adding support for BlackBerry, maybe Windows 7 down the road. But you have a single JavaScript API, and it compiles to native code. I was skeptical when I first heard this. How good can it be? But out the other side comes an Xcode project or an Android project, and it is very decent code. In both cases, they use the WebKit JavaScript engine to interpret JavaScript for those times that you have to interpret code at runtime. But for most cases, they're compiling native objects ahead of time during the compile process. There's also a number of for-pay modules that you can use with this. Things like analytics and advertising and geolocation, advanced features, even a PayPal integration that is part of the Titanium ecosystem. But the project itself is open source. It's up on GitHub, github.com/accelerator. It's like accelerator except app, /Titanium Mobile. You can check out the source code. So you have a number of development options. The ones that Appcelerator pushes the most is something called Titanium Studio, and who used to use, I guess, rad rails back in the day to do, I guess who's still using whatever that's called now, Aptana, or nobody's using it anymore. And there's a reason for that I think, I was excited. That's how when I first came to Ruby and Rails a few years ago, I was excited about having an IDE because I was a .NET developer at the time for doing Ruby and Rails. I've since moved to the command line. So if you're an IDE guy, this is a great setup for doing it. It's even got live debugging on the Android platform, where as you develop code or as you change code, the device is updating in real time, which is you need that on Android because one of the nuances that we found doing development on both, on iOS, you live in the simulator and it's very quick, and getting on the device is painful. I mean, you have to take out a third mortgage in your house, and sacrifice your firstborn and stuff just to get a certificate on the device to get that app on your mobile device. With Android, it's far easier to get it on the device, but the simulator takes hours to boot up. It's crazy. So if you're doing Android, this is actually a good fit. But I really don't like IDEs per se. I prefer to work in command line tools, Vim, the terminal. That's just how I'm comfortable coding. Who's the same way? Fair number of cohorts out there. Fortunately, there's a CLI for Titanium. Let me show you that real quickly. And live coding is always a bad thing, so bear with me if this bombs. So I've aliased Titanium to where it actually lives down in the library. Bump that up a bit. Can you guys see that? So basically, my Titanium command line points to library application support, Titanium Mobile SDK, OS 10 1.72, which is the version number, Titanium Python. Don't worry about the .py, it's not important. .py, it's not important. So now, if I just type Titanium, number of options. This should look familiar if you're a Rubyist and dig around in the command line. So I can create a project, even create a module, run the project. So let's do a create here real quick. Run, there we go. So Titanium create, I pass it the platform, in this case iPhone. The type is project. We're going to name it LSRC and give it an ID. It's wrapping here. Essentially the reverse DNS type of ID that is common in this type of development. Tells me it created the project. So now if I cd into LSRC and mate this guy, you can see the project that it generated. I'll just call out the main points here. There's a resources folder that has an app.js in it, and this is the entry point for the app. And it uses the factory pattern. The whole API is a factory pattern to create windows. We're adding, creating a tab group, adding windows to that tab group, creating tabs, and it's a very verbose way to create applications, but it works. There's no graphical user interface yet for designing these applications. It's all very verbose, but essentially we create the window, create tabs, add a label to the window just for debugging in this case, and at the end we call tab group open. So now I can run this with my run command. Titanium run dot is the current folder, and we're going to tell it we're building an iPhone application. It's now compiling to Objective-C under the hood. If this works, we'll bring up a simulator. So now we have a native application, simple native app with 2 tabs. You see I'm switching between window 1 and window 2. Very, very simple. But up until recently, you had to go native even to get something like a tab control at the bottom of the screen, because position fixed in web applications meant position fixed to the window and not the viewport. So it would scroll off screen. That's getting fixed in iOS 5, I believe, but even to do something that simple required a native app. So that is a quick look at the Titanium CLI. And that part is all open source. It's up on GitHub. So fortunately, there's a CLI. Unfortunately, it's written in Python. Nothing against Python. I just don't speak Python. So extending it is not an option really for me. And so you may be asking, I'm a Rubyist. We're at a Ruby conference. What's this have to do with Ruby? This is where it gets interesting. So if you're building mobile applications, this is where you can leverage your Ruby skills. You still need a server API, unless you're using someone else's commercial API off the shelf. So it usually means Rails and Sinatra. So we built Golf Status. The guys at Code Wranglers, Robert Evans, and his team built a API, or a website and an API on top of that using Rails and some other Ruby tools. But if you want to do it on the mobile side and the client side, you really need to embrace your inner polyglot, which means CoffeeScript. Who's using CoffeeScript? I see on the schedule Matt's giving a talk on CoffeeScript next, so be sure and hang around for that, because I'm sure he'll dazzle you with the wonders that are CoffeeScript. Essentially, CoffeeScript is a different dialect of JavaScript. It compiles down to JavaScript, much like Sass or Haml compile down to CSS and HTML. Over on the left is JavaScript. On the right is CoffeeScript. I don't know about you, but I'd rather write this. No curly braces and semicolons. What's that look like in a tangible example? Here's a button that we're creating in Titanium. So the factory pattern, Titanium UI create button, pass it the properties. I can add a event listener there at the bottom. In CoffeeScript, it looks like that. So this dash rocket, or the stabby proc that Hal was calling it, is a inline way to write a function in CoffeeScript. Just a lot less verbose syntax. Which means you can also use JavaScript Frameworks. Who's using underscore? Cool, yeah. You can use jQuery and some other frameworks out there, but I mean, why use something that's tied to the DOM? There really is no DOM when you're developing these native applications. I use underscore and find that it adds a lot of things to JavaScript that I wish were there already. Although, when you start building JavaScript applications on top of WebKit or something like this, even if it's a mobile application, and you get free and clear of that DOM, it's amazing how powerful JavaScript is when you're not having to deal with browser irregularities. You'll be amazed at what's been added to JavaScript that you just probably haven't played with just because you couldn't use it in Internet Explorer. Style sheets. Titanium also has the notion of JavaScript style sheets. So we're creating 2 buttons here and declaring some properties. You can probably see some duplication, but this is the factory pattern at work. We can factor that out. We've taken button 1 and 2 and taken what's common between them, factored out into a button class, and now we've assigned IDs to button 1 and button 2. The biggest win here is not only reuse, but remember back in the day with the web, we wanted to separate presentation from content with CSS. We've jumped back into the same problems, and JSS and Titanium seems to solve that problem again by allowing us to put all of our paint and colors and fonts and things into style sheets we can update quickly as designs change without having to go through and find where the behavior is implemented and affect the look and feel as well. And JavaScript style sheets work just like CSS, but I don't like CSS. What to do? I had a wild, harebrained thought that maybe Sass and Compass would solve this problem, and you know what? It did. So here's that same style sheet, button 1, button 2 again, and the common elements there in the button class. But that meant that I would have to assign a button ID or unique ID to each object, and then also assign that class name if they're going to share that behavior. With Compass, I can, or this is just plain Sass, but you can use Compass as well, it still works. I can factor that out into a button mix-in, and this syntax writes the same. Compass and Sass don't care if these are non-standard CSS properties. It's going to spit out the same syntax that we would expect with CSS, and it works as JavaScript style sheets as well. So now we get Compass supplied mix-ins that we can now package up all of our familiar patterns and take them from project to project. One of the things that we did in golf status that I've used in a couple of projects now, the pull to refresh type of list that you see in the Twitter app and some other iPhone apps, it's now become kind of a standard. I see it in the Facebook app now. There's just some standard styling that we want to do on those types of application interfaces, so we can bundle those up into patterns and then take them from project to project and not have to reinvent the wheel. And I did promise you some Ruby. Let's dive into some code real quick. Mobile. I'm going to have this open already. Here we go. So let's look at what we get out of the box with this type of architecture. So we're writing CoffeeScript that gets compiled down to JavaScript. So in the Titanium example we looked at earlier, there's a resource folder, and it expects an app.js and your other resources to live there, and that's what it gets compiled down to either Objective-C Cocoa projects or Android Java projects. But since we're writing CoffeeScript, we've put that up into a source folder, and all of our coffee lives here. Any of the other assets can go down in resources. So instead of app.js, we have app.coffee. Sets up some namespaces here at the top of the stack and includes some vendored JavaScript frameworks that we're also using. And the other thing about Titanium is every time you use a JavaScript library or JavaScript context, without getting too deep into Titanium architecture, you have to include it. So any new JS file needs to be included if it's a new JavaScript context. This was a pain to have to, every time you added a JavaScript file or a coffee file, have to keep adding TI include. So we're using some magic of Rake and the CoffeeScript command line compiler. I'll show you down here at the bottom. To join these into, see if I can hide my drawer 1 second. To compile these into one path of a golf status app. So essentially you have appname.js. So you have one include at the top of the stack. Everything else is based on folder convention, just like in Rails. So if you go in and create a new file, it automatically gets included into your application. So let's look at what that looks like. We have models and views. And you do lose the traditional MVC pattern with Titanium, so there's really no such thing as a controller in this architecture, but we do have models and views. It's essentially, The views are more of a view controller. If you're familiar with Backbone and what Jeremy calls a view in Backbone is pretty much a view controller because the actual view is the DOM that's in the browser. It's pretty much the same setup. So looking at the views, what do these look like? We have windows. We have views. Windows are views, but essentially everything is a factory pattern method where you just declare what you create the function in the top line of the file. Do whatever you need to do inside the body of that method, creating what internal views you need to create, and you return them on the very last line. So every file is its own atomic unit. It's appended to the JS file during the compile process. And since it's its own atomic unit, we can then, they're all decoupled from each other. So as long as it's all included at the top of the stack during the compile process, we can reference other files because all we're doing is calling methods. Show you an example of what a model looks like. So this is our gameplay model, and we're just using a CoffeeScript class in this case. And it has methods for maintaining state of a game during gameplay, properties, that sort of thing, just like you would expect in Rails. And we also have, where's my API? An API wrapper to call the API endpoint and return data. And who's used Faraday or HTTP Party or any Ruby API wrappers? It's pretty much the same concept. I didn't want to drop down and do low-level titanium HTTP access for getting data back and forth between the system and the client. So this is pretty much a poor man's CoffeeScript version of HTTP Party here in a single file that knows how to manage a request just for this API endpoint. And this is a callback-driven architecture, as you would expect in a JavaScript application. But doing that allows me to declare certain low-level methods like request, and then build on top of that for get, post, and deletes. And then build on top of that my domain type of methods like register, authenticate, logout. So it's much friendlier. And we just have a callback architecture that in that options hash I can pass success and error callbacks. And when I'm calling them from higher in the stack, then they're just passed and called when the operation actually completes. And if you haven't dealt with CoffeeScript, that at syntax is not a instance variable like it is in Ruby. It's a shortcut to this dot, which makes it just really readable to say this dot register, pass it the options, and on we go. So the other thing that I wanted to do when moving the command line, I showed you how we could compile that application earlier with just ti run. The problem is the output when we did that wasn't color-coded. One of the things that I missed about moving outside of Titanium Studio was that that color-coded output. So in our Rake file, I know there's probably some Ruby gems that we could utilize to do this, but we're piping the output through Perl and adding the terminal codes on the way out, so we get some nice color-coded output here. So we're taking a compile to, I haven't done a clean build in a while, so it's compiled in the CoffeeScript, but it compiles the CoffeeScript, compiles the Sass, and if either one of those bomb, it will return an error. Now it's actually building on a clean build here the Cocoa. And it should drop us into start debugging the log here in a minute. All right, loads the simulator. I got a problem with GPS and Lion I have not figured out yet. So, but it also debugs our objects. If we do a console.log, you'll see the objects here in the console. Also, you'll see some curl callbacks. Curl is what is the project that Appcelerator created off of WebKit. It's a fork of WebKit that allows them to do the JavaScript interpretation on the device itself. So some of these are actually function callbacks. They'll show up as a curl callback because they're going across processing boundaries there. Some of these are just JSON objects. Not a big fan of how they format their JSON with the semicolons and things. It looks more like JavaScript, but those are essentially JSON objects that are getting dumped there. So now I can interact with the application, and if I do a console log or console debug, then it would show up in the appropriate color in that terminal output, which is really cool. So we took patterns from several different projects and started harvesting them into a gem we released called TI for Titanium. To install it, just gem install TI. And now you get generators. So TI, new ID platform, same thing we had with the Python command line. We can spit out a new project. But not only a new project in that same way Titanium gives it to us, it's in that other folder structure with opinions baked in for CoffeeScript, Sass, and Compass, and all the other examples I just showed you. So you would just do TI new, the name of the application, the ID, which platforms you want to support, and it spits out something like that. You also can generate model views, windows, any other GUI type there, and it's just going to give you a new file in the appropriate path, the appropriate factory method stepped out, and you just add your body to it. So something like this. And you just expand after the view, whatever you wanted to do to compose your views there. Also scaffold certain things that are, I guess, macros that are beyond one view. Also can compile. Compile either all your assets, just the coffee, or the Sass. We'll also build your application. Because in a TI project, you can support multiple platforms with a single code base. Although I found you don't get 100% reuse just because differences in application architectures and even device types. I mean, Android has a hardware back button. iPhone doesn't, so that usually tends to lead in differences of design. So Java taught us it's not right once run anywhere. So don't expect the same thing with Titanium. I think 80–90% reuse is probably what you get. So the TI gem, Robert Evans, Rupat Ganguly, and Julio Francisco, I believe is his last name, are contributors there. But we need your help if this is something that you want to get involved with. Testing is a big Achilles heel, the soft underbelly of our applications right now. We're playing around with Jasmine. Who's used Jasmine? So getting that Jasmine output right now, the integrations that we've seen are views that run within Titanium, and you have to get inside the Titanium context at some point, but I would rather see output that goes to the terminal instead of your test harness running directly in a view. But there are some rudimentary attempts at this. I'll put the slides up on the Speaker Rake site later, but there's a Jasmine Titanium project to do that. Nib support. Someone has written a nib to JS, I guess, command line utility here that will take XML from a nib, turn it into JavaScript for Titanium. So if you wanted to craft your UIs with a GUI, you could do that and then pull those into Titanium. So the next logical step is JS to Coffee. So you go nib to JS and JS to Coffee. I'd rather go nib directly to Coffee, but this is, we'll take baby steps to get there. Any questions? Sure.
How do you handle those device-specific cases you were talking about? Do you just have different branches of the code then at that point? Or?
You can conditionally, branch inside the executable, or you can sorry. How do you handle differences in device architecture between iPhone and Android? You can, if platform Android, if platform iPhone during the while it's running. Or sometimes you can get abstract, if it's just image types, they're in the resources folder. Based on naming convention, you can drop things into iPhone folder, and it will use that image if it's an iPhone. Titanium, I didn't show it here, has some really cool ways to support, even on iPhone, the differences between Retina display and regular iPhone 3GS and prior displays. They have a naming convention, and if you name your image assets with the @ symbol, 2x at the end, it will use that on Retina displays and use the other one on non. So if you just, what our workflow has been is every asset we save at 2x and then save it at 50% for the older devices, and then just save both of those versions.
So in our office, I recently did a 2-day hackathon thing with Titanium to see how I liked it. I found its iOS support to be really good, and I ran into a lot of issues getting the stuff running on the Android was hoping to find some information in like the free question and answer thing they've got that's said to be kind of like Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
I didn't really see my problem on there, and I didn't want to pay for support just for like, you know, the little hackathon project, but I'm guessing you're probably doing the paid support version.
No. So the question is, how do you do development with Titanium in spite of their documentation, in spite of their fragmented Android support? So there's a couple of questions there. Let me tackle them both. So on the Android front, I found the same frustration moving to the Android platform where certain things just did not work on Android. And that is because they started with the iPhone and Android is catching up. I would say probably it's 80–85% coverage of what's in the API works across both. There's actually some things that they support better on Android. They just aren't available yet on iOS, things like web intents and some other things that are available on Android. As far as the documentation, it's getting better. There's a wiki. I'm not doing the paid support. Fortunately, one of the leads lives in Denton, where I live, and so we co-work once a month, so I can hit him up for some free support there. But yeah, the question and answer format of that site leaves some to be desired.
Maybe an off-topic question, but what do you do about fonts? I mean, I know how to deal with fonts on the web, but on a...
It supports custom fonts. Just be careful about the licensing. You can use OTF or TTF, but be sure you have a license to distribute that font.
There's another Ruby library called Real Mobile. It also, I think, also does Android and iPhone. If you look at that, and how it's shared.
It's been a while. PhoneGap's another one. Most of those applications are shims, where they're meant to give you an App Store wrapper and provide a little bit of a shim to the hardware-specific capabilities of the device, but build your app using web technologies. This is a totally different approach. You're using JavaScript, so if you know the web, you can leverage that, but you're building a native app out the other side.
The stock application for Real Mobile looks like garbage. You just create a new one and you got it for 2 seconds.
There's actually some high-profile Titanium apps in the App Store. The NBC Universal app, the Late Night with Jimmy Fallon app is built in Titanium. It's quite robust.
How do you handle cases where Titanium hasn't provided the necessary JavaScript API for what you want to do?
You can extend it. Things. How do you do if you find gaps in the API? I didn't touch this, but you can, in that TI generator, one of the options was to generate a module. So if you do know Objective-C, you can extend it. You can actually write modules in JavaScript. There's just patterns that you want to take from project to project and have them imported as modules. You can do that. And you can write them in Java if you're supporting Android. So if you know those applications, frameworks, you can extend the entire API. We had to do that in an early, we built a calculus and biology apps for ThinkWell here locally, I guess about 1.5 years ago. And there was no StoreKit integration at the time, so we built a custom module for StoreKit just to be able to do in-app purchases inside of our Titanium apps.
Is there any other kind of third-party library or some tool for interacting with RESTful like web APIs to build a form or data input?
For Titanium, so any API wrappers for Titanium, I haven't seen them. I'm interested in seeing if there's something that, we're not recreating this wheel with every application, but yeah, I haven't seen anything out there.
What about storage?
There's local storage. What we found, there's also SQLite database, but NoSQL has spoiled me from doing create table anymore. So a lot of times I'm just pulling down JSON, storing it in the file system, and then rehydrating that with JSON parse.
Did you feel like, so it compiles to Objective-C, do you feel, how much knowledge of Objective-C did you feel like you had to know to continue from that point to do the deployment and all that?
I could follow the Objective-C that it wrote, but a lot of it was meta type programming that wasn't tangible. There wasn't a one-to-one correlation with what's happening in the app. It was more of a framework that it was spitting out. But you could load that Xcode project in Xcode and compile it, and you could cut the code at some point if you wanted to. There were certain times that we did have to open Xcode to do certificates and get builds on iPhones and things of that sort as the tool chain has matured. All right. Anybody excited about using Titanium? Cool. If you are interested in the platform, there's a Code Strong conference, and they've got a 2-for-1 deal coming up through August 20th. If you hurry, you and a buddy can go for the price of one. It's out in San Francisco. I'll be giving an extended version of this talk out there. I'm Penguin on Twitter. And we appreciate your feedback, both positive or negative, at speakerrate.com/t/7830. Thanks.